Hello. Today we begin a discussion of informal fallacies. What are informal fallacies? Well, let's see if we can start the definition by way of what we already know. We know that when we have a deductive argument that is successful, it's valid. If it is logically correct, that is, if it's valid and the premises are actually true, it is called a sound argument. On the other side, in the other category of argument, an inductive argument that is strong is an argument whose premises make the conclusion most likely or probably true. A strong argument whose premises are actually true is called a cogent argument. So the best possible deductive argument is a sound one. The best possible inductive argument is a cogent one. But what about those invalid and so unsound arguments and those weak and so uncogent arguments? What is it that makes them that way? Well, we've talked about an invalid argument as a deductive argument whose premises do not guarantee the conclusion. And we've characterized a weak argument as an inductive argument whose premises do not support the conclusion as probably or likely being true. But let's talk a little bit more about what it is that makes these failures occur. Now, first, let's separate off the deductive argument. A deductive argument that fails is considered to be formally fallacious or formally erroneous. A fallacy is an error in reasoning. So a formal fallacy is a fallacy of structure. We're going to focus on informal fallacies. In other words, we're going to focus on those inductive argument types that are weak. Specifically, we're going to look at patterns of weakness. So there are ways in which certain types of inductive arguments fail. They have similar failures, or they fail in similar ways. So we classify them under certain patterns. One thing that you should bear in mind before we really get started on this study is that there are loads of fallacious arguments out there, types of arguments that have gone wrong. If you were, for example, to do an internet search for informal fallacy, you'll come up with pages that list hundreds of fallacy types. So there are lots and lots and lots of ways that arguments can go wrong on that informal side. What I don't want you to do is to think, oh no, I've got to memorize all these. Instead, what we're going to do is to hone in on a group of arguably the most common fallacies. And what's most important to our study is that you can describe, you can articulate what has gone wrong and why. So one of the things you'll want to be able to do when you're confronted with a fallacy is you'll want to be able to say, okay, here is the premise, or here are the premises, here's the conclusion. So the person is arguing thus and such. The error that they're making is this. In other words, you want to describe the mechanics of the error. And then you want to describe why making this error is problematic. Why is it that this type of reasoning is said to fail, whereas another type of reasoning is said to be successful? You're going to find that there are some basic general categories of failure. For example, there are arguments that fail because rather than attempting to prove that a claim is true, the argument diverts attention to the audience's emotional or psychological state. So instead of believing for independent objective reasons that a conclusion is true, you'll be swayed either by fear or pity or a desire to belong, right? So what we want to be able to do is identify the mechanism whereby a piece of reasoning fails and describe why that's a failure. So in this part of the course, you're actually going to do a fair amount of writing, and I'll give you templates for how you can articulate the what's gone wrong and why it's a problem in this process of analyzing informal fallacies. What will happen then when you take your exam is this. You won't have, at least on the part of the exam that deals with the informal fallacies, an auto grading process. I found that I'm not a big fan of the way that our course management or learning management system auto grades short answers. So I will be doing that manually. So when you write an exam involving fallacies and involving other material, the fallacy part will remain ungraded until I get to it. But that's just sort of a procedural issue that I wanted to mention. More important, of course, is learning how you can detect a given fallacy, how you can avoid being the victim of a given fallacy. In other words, how you can avoid being taken in by somebody's poor reasoning. And then how you can explain, let's say, to someone how their reasoning fails. And then, equally important, is you learning how to avoid engaging in fallacious reasoning yourself. So, this is a fairly large section. We've got quite a few fallacies to study. So, don't feel overwhelmed. If you need to stop the video to sort of get your bearings or to do some practice, great, do that. You'll notice that we break up our fallacies into several categories, and so the category break might be your time to stop the video and maybe do some practice with the exercises in the text or review the material before moving on. In any case, let's get started. So we're going to start off with an overview of informal fallacies. We'll talk a little bit about what a fallacy is. We'll talk a little bit about how they're classified as they are in our textbook. And then we'll get into a slew of patterns of poor reasoning that are classified under fallacies of relevance and then under unwarranted assumption. And then we'll stop the video because we're covering Baronet Chapter 4, Sections A to B first, and then we will move on to Section C. You'll notice as we proceed that our examples will be spread out in such a way that we're really covering Section D, recognizing fallacies in ordinary language, throughout both videos. So first off, we have to understand that a fallacy is an error in, a fallacious argument rather, is an error in reasoning. And there are two ways in which there can be logical fallacies. One is a formal fallacy, and we saw that there are quite a few instances of formal errors in reasoning when we were studying the distinction between a valid and an invalid argument. So here's an example of a formally valid piece of reasoning. And then here's an example of a formally invalid piece of reasoning. So a valid piece of reasoning can look like this: A or B, not A, therefore B. And a formally invalid piece of reasoning example looks very similar to the formally valid piece of reasoning, but it's structurally flawed. A or B, A, so not B. And again, here's another example of a valid piece of reasoning: if A, then B, A, therefore B. And a formally invalid piece of reasoning: if A, then B, B, therefore A. Now, when we're dealing with informal errors of reasoning, we're not talking about an error that's created by the structure of the argument, but instead it's typically, but not always the case, that the reasoning is flawed because the arguer preys on our emotions, a psychological state, diverts our attention, misrepresents another's reasoning, and so forth. So there's sort of no architectural problem with the reasoning. It's the content that's flawed. Specifically, the content's premise to conclusion relation for the reasons I mentioned just a moment ago. Nevertheless, these are psychologically or emotionally compelling pieces of reasoning, and that's why we tend to fall prey to them. So let's just remind ourselves of a few ways in which we can talk about what would be good reason for a claim and what we would consider to be evidence for a claim. In law, there are rules of evidence. We can talk about circumstantial evidence, physical evidence, a preponderance or an abundance of evidence. We can talk about reasonable doubt as the standard whereby we conclude that, let's say in a criminal case, someone is guilty or not. In science, we have empirical standards that are interpreted. Empirical evidence that's interpreted with scientific standards, which involve scientific methodology. And then we oftentimes think about evidence in terms of our own experience, testimony, analogical reasoning, statistical reasoning. But it still is the case, as we will see, that in any environment, reasoning can go horribly wrong. So let's take an example of a fairly common way of reasoning and talk about it in terms of what seems to be working well and where we might critique it. If each of us ought to be free to assume risks that we think are worth taking, shouldn't athletes have the same freedom as anyone else to take performance-enhancing drugs? In particular, if athletes prefer the gains in performance allegedly provided by the use of steroids, along with the increased risk of harm to the alternative of less risk and worse performance, what gives anyone the right to interfere with their choice? After all, if we should not forbid smokers from risking their health by smoking, why should we prohibit track stars or weightlifters from taking risks with their health in pursuit of their goals? So notice that the context of the argument is the risk to our health of performance-enhancing drugs and whether or not each of us should be allowed to take that risk. And the arguer makes a comparison to smoking. So one of the ways in which you can analyze this argument is in terms of whether or not the analogy to smoking is a good one. Are there enough positive comparisons between the discussion of the health risks of smoking and us not being forbidden to smoke? In principle, anyway, we might not be allowed to smoke at certain areas, but if we want to smoke cigarettes, we may. Nobody comes into our house and tells us to stop doing it. Are there enough positive comparisons there with steroid use? So the way that we talk about arguments, as we've seen when we were discussing strong and weak inductive arguments, is to see, in this case, how strong and relevant are the comparisons between smoking and steroid use. Here's another example from inductive reasoning. 93% of studies on student testing, including the use of large-scale and high-stakes standardized tests, found a, quote, positive effect on student achievement, according to a peer-reviewed 100-year analysis of testing research completed in 2011 by testing scholar Richard P. Phelps. Therefore, standardized testing improves education in the U.S. Here again, we have a piece of experiential reasoning. We have an argument based on a statistic about student testing. And what you want to do when you're evaluating this argument, among the things you want to do, is to see if there is a strong enough correlation between what the studies found about student testing and the conclusion about standardized testing generally improving education in the U.S. You can ask questions about the statistics. What's the standard deviation, for example? Is it the case that the studies were done in such a way as to comport with standards on doing, let's say, surveys and so forth? So, what we want to do is distinguish when we're evaluating an argument how well the evidence does or does not support the conclusion. What an argument should do is withstand scrutiny. So, I mentioned just a moment ago with the analogical and statistical reasoning examples that you need to be able to analyze the argument and sort of push that argument and see if it withstands some critique. In addition, a strong argument should provide intellectually compelling evidence. And I really want to emphasize this idea of the intellectual force of the argument, because as we will see, so many ways in which reasoning goes bad depends on appealing to our emotional states, our psychological states, as opposed to evidence upon which we can all agree and then see where it leads us. So, a strong argument isn't going to prey upon our emotions. In addition, a strong argument does not win, if you will, by making a competing argument look bad. Now, I mentioned a little bit ago that our textbook divvies up fallacies, patterns of reasoning according to certain categories. And I think I also mentioned that depending on what textbook you open, you're going to get different groupings or different classifications. And I'm less concerned with identifying a fallacy as belonging to thus and such a category as I am with being able to articulate what the arguer has done wrong, what's the error that the argument is making in terms of the mechanical error, and then why it's problematic. Having said that, it might be useful to you to think about fallacies as being categorized as fallacies of relevance, where the conclusion just doesn't follow. There's just too big a gap between the premises and the conclusion. Fallacies of unwarranted assumption, where the arguer relies on an illicit and typically erroneous assumption to make the argument go forward. And fallacies of ambiguity and diversion. Sorry, I left the word diversion off of the slide here, but you can see it in your textbook. When we succumb to a fallacy of ambiguity, what happens is the arguer has adjusted or otherwise shifted language in such a way that a poor inference either can be drawn or is drawn. And then diversion is a pretty diabolical part of the classification of fallacy of ambiguity or diversion, in that when someone argues by way of a diversionary tactic, they're getting us to look elsewhere, or they are effectively distorting somebody else's position so that their argument can look better. I mentioned to you that there's really no official classification. It is the case that Mia, might find that that all fallacies, in a sense, fail to have a premise conclusion support such that they're all fallacies of relevance. Or I might say, oh no, I'm going to classify fallacies according to those that prey on a certain emotion. But so it really doesn't matter how you classify. What does matter is that when you do classify a number of fallacies, or when you group fallacies under a certain heading, what you're doing is you're helping yourself organize your thinking about fallacies. So let's move on. First, I want to mention that we're so lucky to have a lot of resources at our disposal. It's not a bad idea to look around at some of the good ones. It's after a while you sort of develop an eye for what works and what doesn't in terms of accuracy and so forth when it comes to videos where the video maker is telling you that thus and such is an example of this, that, or the other fallacy, and you think, no, I don't think that person's right. The more you study fallacies, the easier it gets to see what the main problem is in a given piece of reasoning. I do think that the website that you see, the link to which you see at the bottom of this slide, is a really nice introduction to fallacies. So you might want to check that out at some point. Okay, first off, fallacies of relevance. These are fallacies that typically rely on getting at some emotion of ours. And the problem is that the premises don't have any relation to the conclusion, largely because the arguer is using some sort of either emotional attack or some sort of appeal to your emotion in order to get you to agree with the conclusion. And the emotion's just not relevant to the issue at hand. So we'll run through these and look at some examples. You'll notice that for each fallacy name, I have an introductory slide with 3 bullet points. A definition of the fallacy, the sort of mechanics of the fallacy, and then an explanation or an attempted explanation as to why the reasoning fails. I strongly encourage you to use this format when you analyze and evaluate a piece of reasoning that you're pretty sure is fallacious. First, what you want to do is determine what's going wrong here. So when you make an appeal to emotion, you argue in such a way that prompts someone to feel something and then form a belief based on the feeling rather than the evidence. And the mechanical problem with this reasoning is that emotions just are. They don't have truth values. So a sentence about an emotion has a truth value. I feel sad. That's either true or false. But my feeling isn't evidence that such and such a conclusion is correct. So let's take a look at some ways in which people argue by way of an appeal to emotion. Arguably, the most popular is the ad hominem, that is the personal attack. An ad hominem is a personal attack when, rather than addressing a position that someone has put forward, or rather than addressing an argument that someone has put forward, instead you attack the person, not their argument. So the ad hominem occurs in the context of argument making. It's not just an arbitrary out of nowhere attack against the person, right? So, if out of nowhere I walk up to somebody and I say, "You're stupid," or "You're dumb," or "You have the wrong political beliefs, I don't like you," those two being conflated, by the way, you're not actually engaged in the fallacy known as ad hominem. Instead, again, person A advances an argument or advances a position, and then person B ignores the argument, ignores the position, and instead attacks the person. So let's say not liking a person doesn't make that person's argument or that person's position bad or wrong. So what someone claims and their argument in support of what they claim is entirely distinct from whether or not we like them or think they'll gain in some way if the argument succeeds. Let's take a look at how this works. So here are some versions. X is a bad argument because Y, who advanced it, doesn't know what he or she is talking about. X is a bad argument because Y, who advanced it, is a jerk, ugly, mean, etc. X is a bad argument because the person advancing it is only doing so because of their affiliation with a group that supports X, or X has a vested interest in seeing the claim succeed. And X is a bad argument because Y, who advanced it, didn't follow his or her own advice.
Amen. Okay. We have a problem in this country. It's called Muslims. We know our current president is one. You
Right.
know he's not even an American.
We need this
Birth
question. This is
certificates,
the first
man.
question.
But anyway, we have training camps growing where they want to kill us. That's my question. When can we get rid of
We're going to be looking at a lot of.
Okay, so what you heard in the video obviously wasn't an explicitly formulated argument, and I think that there's more going on than what I have as an attempt at formulating the argument. But I think it's something anyway like this. Muslims are not real Americans. They are terrorists training to kill Americans. Our president, being a Muslim himself, won't stop the terrorists. Therefore, when we get rid of the current president, the new president should get rid of Muslims. It's hard to analyze the argument in a charitable way, largely because there are statements that the man makes that are just simply false. But part of what he wants to do is to say that we can't trust the position that a Muslim would take. We can't trust our president. He's Muslim, right? Where apparently being Muslim is a bad thing. And so what he's doing is he's basically saying, look, don't listen to the president and don't listen to Muslims. They're dangerous. And so we need to get rid of them. And then any president who comes on the scene should be committed to doing that. There's other stuff going on, but I think this is a fairly common example of the way in which an ad hominem is explicitly stated. I mean, he's making overt personal attacks, but there's an implicit attack against a position or against a group of people just because of their religious affiliation. Here's another example from the book or the film, I, Robot. One of the characters is having a conversation with a robot, and Sonny, the robot, is taking umbrage to what Spooner says. Spooner says, robots don't feel fear, they don't feel anything, they don't eat, they don't sleep. Sonny says, I do, I've even had dreams. And Spooner says, human beings have dreams, even dogs have dreams, but not you. You're just a machine, an imitation of life. Can a robot write a symphony? Can a robot turn a canvas into a beautiful masterpiece? And Sonny responds, can you? Now, there's more than one thing going on here, but as far as the ad hominem goes, basically in the context of a conversation that Spooner and Sonny are having, what Spooner is saying is effectively, we don't need to listen to you, or I don't need to listen to you, Sonny, because you're just a robot. You're in a sense, you're not human. You're not worth listening to. And then there are some great cartoons, or not cartoons, but photos that people make cartoons out of effectively by way of the little text bubbles. And here we have one goose saying, we share many genetic characteristics with ducks because we have evolved from a common ancestor. And the other goose says, you're closed-minded and stupid and you eat corn. You don't know anything. So rather than addressing the claim that the first goose makes and saying, I disagree and here's why, the claim that the first goose makes is being completely disregarded and on the basis of apparently that goose being closed-minded and stupid and eating corn. And then another one with what look to be a couple of sparrows. One makes the claim, the moral claim, I believe that human cloning is wrong, rather than addressing that. This is one of those versions of an ad hominem where what you say is being thrown out because of some characteristic, in this case apparently being an idiot. So the second sparrow says, of course you'd say that. You're an idiot. So the content is just entirely disregarded. And then to be politically fair to both sides, here's another version of ad hominem, this time committed by President Obama, or actually, this was candidate Obama back in 2008.
This is in the best interest of the United States.
Sarah Palin, taking aim at your decision to restrict use of nuclear weapons, your pledge not to strike nations, non-nuclear nations, who abide by the non-proliferation treaty. Here's what she said. She said, it's unbelievable. No other administration would do it. And then she likened it to kids on a playground. She said, you're like a kid who says, punch me in the face, and I'm not going to retaliate.
Yeah.
Your response?
I really have no response to that. The last I checked, Sarah Palin's not much of an expert on nuclear issues.
So, as a political strategy, it makes sense. You paint your opponent as someone who doesn't know what they're talking about, and that undermines their credibility. And it may very well be the case that Sarah Palin was not the best candidate, was not the most adept at matters of policy and governing and so forth. And that's the biggest difficulty that we have, I think, with the ad hominem is it's at times really tempting. Someone may say something that's just outrageously wrong. And instead of just saying, well, you're mistaken that, or you've said something that's not correct, instead we go to the attack, which is, you don't know what you're talking about. And I get that. I understand it. I think we've all been guilty of it. But rather than saying you're not an expert, what you need to do is say, okay, well, what you're claiming is not the case, and lay out, what the facts actually are. So we want to avoid the ad hominem. There are all kinds of ways in which, I should rephrase that. There are all sorts of ways in which there's a real fine line between dismissing what somebody says on the basis of their lack of expertise, and wanting to accept a claim as true based on somebody's expertise. And what I mean by that is this. If you go to your doctor's office and your doctor says, oh, it looks like I've done your blood work and it looks like you've got, a bacterial infection, here's some antibiotics. Or, I've looked, your symptoms are very common of this winter's, flu, here's some medication. You're probably not going to ask the doctor to prove it. You accept the doctor as an authority, and you accept that the conclusion the doctor has come to about your condition is correct, and you accept that the conclusion that you should take the antibiotics. Having said that, however, it's also the case that if you're dealing with something rather serious, your doctor might say, look, it's important for you to get a second opinion, or you say, I should get a second opinion. And that's a way of showing that you're not simply relying on that person's expertise. So so going back then to this problem of ad hominem, you have, for example, the uproar in some circles over Pope Francis's encyclical on climate change. And a lot of people were criticizing the Pope, saying that he should stick with religious matters, not with scientific issues, because that should be left to the scientists. But the reality is that if the Pope wants to make an argument about climate change, then we should deal with whether or not that argument's any good, not that he does or doesn't have the expertise to mount it. Some people fell prey, I think, to this ad hominem because they said, well, wait a minute, he's got a master's, I think, in chemistry, so he's qualified to speak on this. But even if we're thinking about his qualifications, he was speaking in the context of his qualification as a a religious moral leader and mounted a moral argument. He accepted as fact climate change. So when somebody like this person, Steve Malloy, sort of badmouths the Pope and basically associates him with communism, and then basically dismisses him on that basis, a sort of guilt by association, you've got a version of an ad hominem. In addition, to say that he shouldn't be listened to, the Pope shouldn't be listened to because he's not a scientist, is a flat out ad hominem. And then we have an example that I think is fantastic. I think it's a complicated fallacy that's being committed by the woman who's second from the right, not the woman in the pink coat, but the woman next to her. You'll see this slide again, or sorry, you'll see this video again in a little bit, but take a listen and then we'll talk about this.
Expressed concern before about this meeting, and times are tough right now, and we've cut teachers' positions, and we're rationing paper, and this is a trip to the beach. So if there's any way that you could take care of business, either video conferencing or pay for the trip out of your own pocket, and while this is going on, we also got a brochure for a nice trip to Boston. And, times are tough right now. I think we need to watch where we're spending our money.
Thank you, Ms. Murphy. Ms. Watson.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Ms. Murphy, that times are tough, because as I see in the October 19, 2011 memo from Dr. Fulmer, he says, combining all the costs referenced below, the lawsuit by Ms. Kim Murphy has cost the school district in excess of $1.9 million. I'm trying to weigh $1.9 million to a school board conference where we learn how to be better school board members to help our district. Which do we get better return for?
So here, like I said, we've got a couple things going on, but the focus right now is the ad hominem. So there was a claim made that the board conference at Hilton Head Island, South Carolina, would spend, the board would be spending a lot of money, the school board would be spending a lot of money going to a conference at Hilton Head, South Carolina, which is a really kind of swanky resort area. And given the budget crisis, the money would be better spent elsewhere. And rather than responding to that, the second person, the one who is next to the woman in pink, basically said, well, why should we listen to you? You're making the school board spend $1.9 million on some lawsuit. So rather than address the issue that was raised, which is whether or not money should be spent going to a conference on Hilton Head Island in South Carolina, she said, well, we shouldn't listen to you because you're spending a lot of money. So it's a really nice ad hominem example. Remember, I mentioned a moment ago that one of the ad hominems against Pope Francis's encyclical was that since Pope Francis wasn't or isn't a scientist, that he should leave the issue of science or of climate change alone. So in a radio interview, Rick Santorum says, the church has gotten it wrong a few times on science. We probably are better off leaving science to the scientists and focusing on what we're really good at, which is theology and morality. When we get involved with controversial and scientific theories, I think the church is not as forceful and not as credible. I've said this to the Catholic bishops many times when they get involved in agricultural policy or things like that are really outside the scope of what the church's main message is. We're better off sticking to the things that are really the core teachings of the church as opposed to getting involved in every other kind of issue that happens to be popular at the time. So The the problem is, if it's the case that the church needs to speak only on issues of theology and morality, there's an assumption there, of course, that anybody who, let's say, wouldn't be a church specialist would not be able to speak on issues of theology and morality, right? Doesn't it go both ways? If it's the case that the Pope shouldn't speak on climate change, maybe it should be the case that people who aren't members of or specialists within the Catholic Church don't get to speak on moral or theological issues. So again, the issue is whether or not the argument that the Pope mounted is any good, not his specific credentials. Okay, the next fallacy we're going to look at is mass appeal or appeal to the people. And here, the main issue is that the arguer says, thus and such is true because everybody believes it or everyone feels it, right? So the truth is said effectively to be dependent on what people believe. But believing a claim simply because everybody else does or because you wish to be accepted is not the same as the claim having been demonstrated. Mass appeal occurs in advertising and politics, maybe to a lesser degree in our own, in our daily lives, but it really is an incredibly effective, albeit poor, mode of reasoning. So here's an example of two famous people in an ad, and the implication is that these people are famous, they're in love, she's wearing a big diamond ring, they're beautiful, and they're wearing fabulous clothes, and somehow, you can be like this too. Everybody can get what they want if they just get on the wagon with Balmain.
Hello, ladies. Look at your man. Now back to me. Now back at your man. Now back to me. Sadly, he isn't me. But if he stopped using lady-scented body wash and switched to Old Spice, he could smell like he's me. Look down. Back up. Where are you? You're on a boat with the man your man could smell like. What's in your hand? Back at me. I have it. It's an oyster with 2 tickets to that thing you love. Look again. The tickets are now diamonds. Anything is possible when your man smells like Old Spice and not a lady. I'm on a horse.
A couple things are going on, but for the purpose of our fallacy, we get the following. If you want your man to be fabulous and gorgeous, you will have him wear Old Spice. The commercial is an appeal to everyone to be able to be like this guy, and whoever this guy's significant other is, by wearing Old Spice.
Everyone's doing it. Guys are doing it with girls, and girls are doing it with other girls. Some go online and do it with complete strangers. Some people like to do it hard. Some people like to be all chatty-catty with people. I've heard there's over 20 million people doing it now, so it's safe to say that everyone is doing it.
All right, so there's a little misdirection here, where you're thinking that this guy is going in one direction and then he goes in another. But I'd like to use this commercial as another example of appeal to the masses. Everybody's playing Call of Duty, therefore you should do it too. Then here are a few examples that again reinforce the problem with mass appeal. 70% of Americans think marriage equality is immoral, therefore you should not support same-sex marriage. An overwhelming majority of Americans, 92%, believe in God and an afterlife, therefore you should stop being an atheist. And most people are coming around to the idea that medical and recreational marijuana use is acceptable, therefore you should endorse the legalization of marijuana. Again, just because a lot of people think something is the case or is a good idea doesn't mean that they're right. And so it doesn't mean that you should follow in their footsteps. There should be independent evidence for a belief, not just what a bunch of other people happen to think is the case. We also have another emotional appeal. This one is the appeal to pity. A conclusion in this case is supported by evoking pity. So you are asked to draw a conclusion based on your feeling sorry for somebody, as opposed to because they've offered you a what I'll call a legitimate reason. So feeling sorry for someone doesn't make what that person claims is true. You know, suppose that somebody has admitted to a vicious murder and then tries to argue that they shouldn't be put in jail for the murder because it will make their mother really upset, and they don't want to make their mother really upset, and their mother is a very sensitive person and will cry all the time and will be devastated. I mean, obviously, whether or not the murderer's mother would be upset is not a legitimate reason to keep that murderer out of jail. So we get an example like this. I have to graduate on time. My future, my whole life depends on me getting to finish college. My family would be devastated. I would be devastated if I didn't get to finish college. How could you fail me like this? You have to change my grade, please. Now, imagine if this person is pre-med and has just managed to fail their capstone project, which sort of is the ultimate, accumulation of all the work that they did. It's probably not the best idea to send them on to med school if they can't even get the basics and more high-level stuff of biology right. So you have to think about, why it would be a good idea, just because you feel sorry for this person, to let them complete the degree. And here is a cartoon where a kid wants to play and appeals to his dad's sense of pity and love in order to get what he wants. Moving on, we have appeal to force or fear. This is a really common fallacy where, rather than giving good reasons to believe a claim is true, a threat of some sort is made. So, think about it this way. If you're standing at the ATM and you're getting cash out and somebody comes up to you with a gun and says, "Give me your money," that's a threat, right? The gun is a threat, and you'll give your money. But what if you are standing at the ATM again and the same person comes up with no gun and just says, "Give me your money"? You probably won't. So I'm not suggesting that you do or you don't give up your money if you have a gun pointed at you. What I'm saying is that the threat is what makes you move, not that there's some legitimate reason that the person has for wanting you to give them your money. So the problem, of course, is that the person who's threatening is basically using the power of that threat to win an argument rather than providing good evidence. So let's take a look at some examples. Here is a one that many parents may have tried with their children. And in fact, the story, The Little Boy Who Cried Wolf, is some sort of arguably an appeal to force or fear. But suppose a child has been caught in a lie and the parent says, "Do you know what happens to little girls and boys who lie?" Child says no. Parent says, "Well, remember when we read The Little Boy Who Cried Wolf?" Child says, "Yes, it was really scary." The parent says, "Yes, it was. Why?" Child says, "Because the boy lied a bunch of times, and so in the end no one believed him, and then when the wolf came for real, no one came to save him." And the parent says, "Exactly. Do you want to end up like that little boy?" Where the lesson is supposed to be, don't lie if you don't want to end up like the little boy. Of course, One thing you might ask is whether a small child can really grasp non-emotional evidence, but that's a question for another time. And here again, a parent is using force or fear to get his child to do something. Maybe I have issues using parent examples. In any case, the parent says to the child, just remember, son, it doesn't matter whether you win or lose, unless you want to lose daddy's love. Okay, inference from ignorance. This is a fallacy that occurs when someone claims that a belief is true because nobody has proven otherwise, or claims that a belief is false, or that somebody's belief is false because nobody has proven it's true. This can be tricky because there are times when it might feel like an argument from ignorance is being made, but in fact it's not the case. So we'll get to that in just a moment. But think about the mechanism this way. X has not been proven true, therefore it is false, or X has not been proven false, therefore it's true. What we need to do when there is a lack of proof is to suspend judgment. And we'll see Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson making this point in a video in a little bit, although I think he's got a little bit of the fallacy wrong. He's talking about the sort of the psychological impetus we have for wanting to draw a conclusion even when we're not entitled to do so. That is when there's a lack of evidence. So there's a play that was made into a movie called 12 Angry Men, and in it the following exchange occurs. Juror 2 says, I just think he's guilty. I thought it was obvious. Juror 8 responds, in what way was it obvious? Juror 2 says, I mean that nobody proved otherwise. So Juror 2 is making an inference that since the individual was not proven to be innocent, it follows that the defendant is guilty. That certainly doesn't follow, and in fact, in a court of law, in a criminal case, it is essential that if the if the defendant is not proven beyond a reasonable doubt to be guilty, instead it follows that he or she is innocent. So the notion that an argument from inference is made in this instance is kind of doubly disturbing. But it also speaks to what we should be doing when there is no evidence to support a claim or to reject a claim. You suspend judgment, and that's effectively what a jury is asked to do in a criminal trial. We do want to make sure that we don't call every single instance where from a lack of evidence to the contrary, we draw an inference to be erroneous. There are times when concluding that some state of affairs is or isn't the case based on a lack of evidence is in fact not an appeal to ignorance. It could be a legitimate piece of reasoning. So, think about when we make in science inferences like that some species has gone extinct. So, for example, there was a belief that this type of fish, the coelacanth, had gone extinct because it wasn't found in all of the normal environments, its sort of usual habitats. And so scientists, marine biologists had concluded it had gone extinct, but then in fact it turned up in a place that nobody had expected. So, but let's not forget that one of the sort of core assumptions in the scientific enterprise is that there's always room for revising, for revision. We should always be prepared to amend our beliefs. And so we can draw conclusions, but they're tentative, and they get stronger when, over time, evidence to the contrary does not show up. So let's take a look at Dr. Tyson talking a bit about what an appeal to ignorance looks like, if you will, psychologically, why it happens. Although, please note that what he's not doing in this case is defining the erroneous inference known as an appeal to ignorance.
UFO. First, remember what the U stands for in UFO. Now, there's a fascinating frailty of the human mind that psychologists know all about, and it's called argument from ignorance. And this is how it goes. You ready? Somebody sees lights flashing in the sky. They've never seen it before. They don't understand what it is. They say, a UFO. The U stands for unidentified. So they say, I don't know what it is. It must be aliens from outer space visiting from another planet. Well, if you don't know what it is, that's where your conversation should stop. You don't then say, it must be anything. Okay? That's what argument from ignorance is. It's common. I'm not blaming anybody. Psychologists know all about it, and it may relate to our burning need to have to know stuff because we're uncomfortable steeped in ignorance.
So one of the reasons why I wanted to include this clip is because Dr. Tyson makes this great point, not only that we sort of have this propensity to not be uncomfortable with uncertainty and with suspending judgment, but also that as a result of that, we want to draw an inference despite our ignorance. And that's something that we really want to make sure as we study philosophy that we get comfortable with. We get comfortable with suspending judgment. You know, I don't have enough evidence. I need to not take a position. You don't have to take a position. But I do want to reiterate, though, that his version of the argument from inference is different from ours, which is to say we're focusing on the move that we make where we move from a lack of evidence to a conclusion to the contrary. He's saying something like that, but it's not exactly like our definition. All right, our next fallacy is called missing the point, and this can be very, very egregiously obvious, and it can also be very, very subtle, maybe nefariously subtle. So what happens is that you think you're going in one direction with some premises. Sort of there's this conceptual connection between the one premise and another, and so you think you're going in one direction conceptually, but then the arguer concludes something that you just didn't see coming. So it's a way in which the conclusion is just not at all relevant to the premises. And I don't see it as being always or often a sort of emotionally driven fallacy or a fallacy that preys on emotions, but instead is simply an error of breaking contact between premises and conclusion. What we'll want to do is distinguish it from a related fallacy known as the red herring. So let's see if we can start making sense of this fallacy, and then we can perhaps talk about it more in relation to red herring when we get there. So here are a couple of examples and explanations of what's gone wrong and why it's a problem. Remember, I mentioned to you that you want to be able to articulate what's happening in the reasoning, what the error is, and why that error is not good to make. So the first example goes like this. Cheating is at an all-time high in high schools and universities across the country. We should, therefore, get rid of tests altogether. Now, typically, we would think that the arguer is going in the direction of addressing cheating as a moral problem, and by maybe trying to change the culture of student attitudes, or student practices, or changing student attitudes, and so therefore changing the culture. But so the elimination of tests isn't going to stop cheating, and that therefore means that the conclusion just doesn't address the issue at hand. Second example, you should move to a rural area. Our society can't continue to see people living in the streets. Now, it could be the case that the word see is being taken in two senses. Remember that when we get to talking about equivocation. But for the moment, let's focus on the main problem here, which is that if you claim our society can't have people living in the streets, the conclusion isn't, well, you should go away, you should move somewhere else where you're not going to see homeless people. Instead, the conclusion should be relevant to addressing this social ill. A piece of dialogue from the 1950 film Harvey is a great example, I should say, of missing the point. So basically, in the film Harvey, there's this guy who keeps seeing an enormous rabbit, which of course is unusual. So the piece goes this way. I started to walk down the street when I heard a voice saying, "Good evening, Mr. Dowd." I turned and there was this big white rabbit leaning against a lamppost. Well, I thought nothing of that, because when you've lived in a town as long as I've lived in this one, you get used to the fact that everybody knows your name. So the direction you should be going in is, oh my gosh, what is an enormous white rabbit doing leaning against a lamppost talking? Not that everybody knows Mr. Dowd's name. And another example of missing the point. Dilbert says, "Why are you sending me to teach COBOL to the Elbonians? Wally is the one who knows COBOL, not me." And his boss says, "Wally said he's busy that day." And Dilbert says, "Can't you reschedule the class?" And his boss says, "Okay, does tomorrow work for you?" So, of course, this is a dig at managers who just don't seem to get they don't get the point. It shouldn't be Dilbert who goes to teach a class. It should be Wally. And if Wally is busy, then the class should be rescheduled for a day that Wally can teach it. And another cartoon. "No, I'm serious. It's all over the news. The only evidence they have of Hitler's body is the busted skull, and they just found out it's actually from a young woman." "I can't believe it," is the response. "Hitler was a chick?" So what's the inference supposed to be? That there's still no evidence that Hitler was killed in the bunker when most people say he was killed. And here is another case of missing the point. Do you remember this fun exchange having to do with school board members attending a conference in Hilton Head, South Carolina? Now, I cut the video off before when I was using it as an example of an ad hominem, but listen now for the missing the point fallacy.
Expressed concern before about this meeting, and times are tough right now, and we've cut teachers' positions, and we're rationing paper, and this is a trip to the beach. So if there's any way that you could take care of business, either video conferencing or pay for the trip out of your own pocket. And while this is going on, we also got a brochure for a nice trip to Boston. And, times are tough right now. I think we need to watch where we're spending our money.
Thank you, Ms. Murphy. Ms. Watson.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Ms. Murphy, that times are tough, because as I see in the October 19, 2011 memo from Dr. Fulmer, he says, combining all the costs referenced below, the lawsuit by Ms. Kim Murphy has cost the school district in excess of $1.9 million. I'm trying to weigh $1.9 million to a school board conference where we learn how to be better school board members to help our district. Which do we get better return for? I would have to say that it would be for the school board conference. And, you know, perhaps $1.9 million doesn't mean a whole lot to you, but it means a whole lot to the rest of us. And if you could actually put that toward teachers and all the other things that we're doing, it would really hire a lot of teachers if we could put it in that way, but it's not that type of money. It could also build some really great classrooms, some great academic programs, or facilities for academic programs, but instead you're wasting $1.9 million. So you want to talk about the conference now?
So we can see that rather than addressing the issue that was raised by the first speaker about spending money on a conference in Hilton Head, South Carolina, the board member draws an inference that the money that has been spent on a lawsuit could be used to improve education by hiring teachers or improving programs or whatever the case may be. So the point that the initial board member was trying to make was that there's not enough money to do this thing that's been proposed, this conference, and the board member who responds basically does not address that issue. We also have appeal to unqualified authority, and this is a fallacy where a conclusion is drawn based exclusively on an authority that is unqualified. Now, remember earlier when we were talking about ad hominem attacks, we said that it's unacceptable to dismiss somebody's argument or position on the basis of their lack of authority in a given area. So, for example, the Pope's position on climate change was not addressed by some critics. Instead, the critics said, well, the Pope's not an authority in this area, and so we shouldn't listen to him. And so the issue never got addressed. Well, similarly, what we should not do is accept what someone says simply on the basis of there being an authority in some area. So, for example, if it's the case that somebody says, well, the Pope said that this being climate change is a moral problem. It is a problem that is going to impact the most desperate people in the world, the poorest, the ones who are most vulnerable. And you say, well, I'm going to believe that it's true because the Pope said it. That's a problem. Not because the Pope is an unqualified authority. He certainly is a religious authority. Not because the Pope is an unqualified authority, let's say as a scientist. I mean, he doesn't make his business science, and so he's arguably not an authority in science. But no, the issue is you're accepting the conclusion based not on the evidence the Pope gives, but on the fact that it's the Pope who's giving it. I suppose if you're Catholic and you're thinking the Pope is speaking ex cathedra, well, we could have that conversation, but I hope you see the point here that what we don't want to do is simply accept a conclusion based on the fact that this person has said it. So he says it, so it must be true. It'd be another thing if, let's say, remember I mentioned earlier, going to the doctor, and I said, well, I accept my doctor as an authority, so I'm going to take this antibiotic. I'm not saying he's saying that I have a bacterial infection and so it must be true. I'm saying that I rely on the credibility of the scientific evidence upon which my doctor is basing the conclusion that I have a bacterial infection, and so therefore I am going to take the antibiotics. That seems to be a more legitimate way to go.
I can't believe it. I'm fine. I'm finally. Whoa, okay, all right. Excuse me, give him some space, thank you.
Give him some room. Give him some room.
Did anyone stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night?
I'm a doctor.
Did anyone stay?
Stay smart.
Dude, we are so stoked.
Going hell aboard, dude. Howdy. Let's rock, dude.
10-4.
Hey, dude, I think that dude wants you.
Well, that's just the pilot.
Dude, you're not the pilot?
No, I've never done this before, but I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night.
Whee!
Stay smart.
Okay, so I just love those commercials, the whole series of them. They're very funny. And what they do is they prey upon this notion that we oftentimes have drawn conclusions about people based on their presumed authority when in fact they don't have that authority. But it's also the case that we find more specifically appeal to inappropriate authority cases when people conclude that thus and such is the case simply because someone said so, who they take to be an authority where that authority is inappropriate. So, it's true because she said so. Well, what if the she who is saying something is speaking outside her area of expertise? Just because she's an expert in one area doesn't mean that everything she says, because she says it, is so. And then a quote from the 2009 film Sherlock Holmes. Watson, the doctor, is choking someone and says, "Relax, I'm a doctor." Well, he's not acting in his capacity as a doctor, and therefore to simply let him do his thing is to make an error in reasoning. The other potential appeal to an appropriate authority is that Old Spice commercial that we watched earlier, where the inappropriate authority is the audience believing that Old Spice is a wonderful aftershave just because a model is telling us so. All right, now we move on to fallacies of unwarranted assumption. And here we have a class of fallacy that is reflective of erroneous reasoning based on making assumptions that are problematic. So there are quite a few here, and it's going to take us a little bit to get through them. What you might want to do before you proceed with this section is to maybe do some practice with the fallacies that we covered in section 4A. Begging the question, sometimes known as slippery slope, or sorry, I can't believe I just said that. Begging the question, sometimes known as circular reasoning, but though is not identical to circular reasoning, is a fallacy whereby an argument's conclusion depends on an unstated assumption that already takes the conclusion to be true. So there's really no proof that the conclusion is true because at least one of the premises, again, typically unstated, is already endorses that conclusion. So take a moment to read through the what it is and why it fails and how it works. Sorry, typically the order that I have for this introductory slide is the how it works comes before the why it fails, but I'm sure you'll get it. So pause for a moment and take a read through this. Now let's take a look at some examples. Government ownership of public utilities is a dangerous doctrine because it is socialistic. So one of the problems here is that the conclusion is simply a restatement of the premise. Government ownership of public utilities just is one of the ways in which we define a socialistic government. And then there's the assumption that's not yet been proven, namely that socialism is dangerous. And we would want to know how so. So we need that to be proven before we can accept the rest of the reasoning. The next one, fox hunting is not cruel since the fox enjoys the fun. There is the assumption that we know what the fox enjoys, that we can know the mind of the fox. Suicide is a crime since it is a crime to murder. There is an assumption that suicide is murder. Not all people agree that it is. So it may be the case that suicide is a crime and it is considered to be an unjustified self-killing, which or an unjustified killing is murder. But the assumption that suicide is murder is unstated and is not something that everybody would necessarily, or that not everybody would obviously agree to. Sorry, I shouldn't have used the word necessarily in there. And then an exchange of dialogue from a novel. The reasoning goes something like this: there are spies in Gaza. The reason you can successfully accuse someone of being a spy is because there are so many spies. So the person who questions, you think there are no spies in Gaza, is assuming that there are already spies in Gaza. And so their justification, there are so many spies in Gaza, doesn't really get that person very far in the reasoning. There are a couple more examples that I think are really straightforward. These may be considered more cases of circular reasoning, where you start in the same place that you leave off. You restate the conclusion your conclusion is a restatement of the premises, just in other words. So we get the following in a motion picture. 3 characters engage in a dispute over 7 stolen pearls. One of the thieves hands 2 to the man on his right, then 2 to the man on his left. I will keep 3, he says. How come you get to keep 3, asks one of the others. Because I am the leader. Oh, but how come you're the leader? Because I have more pearls. And you can see the next question. But why do you have more pearls? Because I'm the leader. How come you're a leader? Because I have more pearls. And then a classic novel, Catch-22, from which the expression, oh, you're in a Catch-22 comes, gives us the following. Yossarian is pointing out, by the way, the Army's circular reasoning. He's not actually committing the fallacy himself. Let me get this straight, Yossarian says. In order to be grounded, I have to be crazy. And I must be crazy to keep flying. But if I ask to be grounded, that means I'm not crazy and I have to keep flying. There's no way, in other words, to get out of flying the missions. And here is another example of circular reasoning.
What is this supposed to mean? What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, he's a fascist. The pirates...
Wait, why do you say he's a fascist? He's the president of the United States.
He's a fascist.
Do you realize how offensive that is?
I think he's a fascist.
Why?
Because he is.
Here's a cartoon that you have to think about just a little bit to get the circular reasoning involved here. So if you'd like to jot down what you think the argument is, such that it is a piece of circular reasoning, do so. Send it to me via email, and I will take a look at it and write back to you with some sort of comment. And depending on how you articulate the reasoning and then how you analyze the reasoning, there will be extra credit for you on the next exam involving fallacies. Okay, our next fallacy is called complex question, and it is a fallacy in which someone asks a question and yet the question is hiding a previous or implicit question that has apparently been asked and assumed to be answered. And so the person is left who attempts to answer the complex question in an untenable position. Here are some examples. Have you stopped beating your dog? If you answer yes, if you answer no, the inference is that you still beat your dog. If you answer yes, the inference is that you used to beat your dog, but you stopped. And you can see from the remaining examples how this particular piece of fallacious reasoning goes. Now remember, this is not a fully formed argument. Instead, the argument is implicit in the question. So just remember, you don't have to ask every question, you don't have to answer every question that's asked of you in such a way as to get yourself committed to a position that you would not otherwise endorse. A classic example: if elected, would you try to fool some of the people all of the time, all of the people some of the time, or go for the big one, all of the people all of the time? And the assumption, of course, is that you would try to fool people in some fashion. Now we move on to ways in which statistical reasoning can go wrong. An inference based on a biased sample is an inference that is an inference that's made from a sample that is not legitimately taken from the population and yet is used to infer something about an entire population. So before we get to how this reasoning fails, let's talk a little bit about statistical reasoning, what it's meant to do, and how it's meant to work. Statistics is the science of learning from data. It is essential to conducting effective research that involves data. Now, I'm leaving the word data undefined, but typically we're talking about anything that you can quantify, right? So typically the data that we're talking about is numerical data or data that you can measure in some numeric way. We live in a world that is increasingly driven by what data tells us. So think about how Amazon and other companies use data to make purchase suggestions for you, or how a company uses data to make business decisions, how scientists use it in medical studies. In fact, if you look at the way that colleges and universities are accredited, you'll find that a major component of this accreditation process is a look at the ways in which the institution does or does not reflect itself as a data-driven institution, so that decisions are based on or driven by what the data tells them. For example, completion rates for courses, completion rates for programs, completion rates for graduation, and so forth. When we're talking about the social sciences in particular, but certainly any scientific endeavor, and we're talking about samples and populations, we're talking about the following: any group of objects, a subset of a population, a sample that accurately reflects the characteristics of the population, and a random sample, which is the sampling that is based on everyone in the population having an equal chance of getting chosen as a sample member. Now let's look at some examples where sampling is not representative or random. Tall people are smarter than short people. A recent study compared the mathematical skills of volleyball and basketball players with kindergartners And this demonstrated the conclusion, namely that tall people are smarter than short people. Now, this is an obviously poor piece of reasoning, but it gives you a flavor of what we're talking about when we're talking about biased samples. The sample here is not representative, but instead is skewed to make tall people appear smarter than short people. Moreover, there is an assumption that math skills are good indicators of intelligence. So one thing to bear in mind when you're looking at news reports about this, that, or the other study that gives you a bunch of statistics is to bear in mind that the study is assumed to have been completed without any kind of bias sampling, but that doesn't mean that that has been successful. Another example, there's no doubt that U.S. citizens think Rihanna's new album is a work of artistic genius. An online poll of music fans shows that this is the case. So the sample is not representative. We don't know about all U.S. citizens because it is very likely the case that the only people who took the online poll are people who either love or loathe Rihanna's new album or Rihanna herself as a performer. In addition, unless there's some sort of control, we don't know how many times individuals voted. Our next fallacy is the fallacy of accident. And this fallacy occurs when a general rule is misapplied to a specific case. So what we want to do is first identify what the policy in question is, and then look at the case to which it's applied and determine how it is a misapplication of that rule or policy. A great example, I think, comes from a case in 2003 in which two teenagers were at a party, and one of them ended up being accused of and serving time for molestation. Now, the problem here is that the law used as the precedent applied in this case was a law intended for child molesters. In other words, it's a law that was not intended for teenagers who, let's assume, were acting consensually, albeit in underage sexual activity. So take a moment to read this example. Now, the opposite direction of inference is called the hasty generalization, and this occurs quite frequently in the form of stereotype making. So whenever you think that someone has made a stereotypical comment that is, let's say, offensive to a certain group, then it's probably the case that that person is using the generalization known as hasty generalization in order to commit that stereotypical thinking. So when we make a general claim based on an inadequate sample size, then we are engaged in hasty generalization. So here are some, I hope, pretty clear examples. The first few sentences of this novel by John Q. Ryder are boring. Therefore, all John Q. Ryder's novels are boring. Yeah, I've met a few Iraqis. They were rude. All those Middle Easterners must be barbarians. Americans are so boorish. I know this because I saw one talking loud on his cell phone in a Paris library. And then a real-life example. When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're bringing rapists, and I assume some are good people, end quote. The implication is still that the vast majority of Mexicans apparently are rapists and criminals, and Mexico is in fact sending these individuals to the United States. What we want to focus on here is the fact that Trump is arguing that there are very, very, very many Mexicans in the United States. Grammatically, he's suggesting that almost all of them are criminals. And I was talking to my neighbor about this when it happened, and he actually has family from Mexico, and he kept referring to his family as clearly criminals. And that was sort of the joke. All you need when you see someone, hear someone committing the hasty generalization fallacy is to provide a counterexample. So this line of reasoning does not bode well either in our daily lives or in the sciences, where it can also occur. In addition to this theme that we're currently on involving samples and populations and sort of misusing the concepts from statistics, we get misleading precision. And this is a great fallacy for advertisers and politicians to commit. So what's typically the case here is that you have a statistic presented as being significant, a significant part of a claim, when in fact it is not. And the fact that it's presented as significant leads to potentially erroneous conclusions. 4 out of 5 dentists surveyed prefer Minty Mint toothpaste to other brands. Get your clothes 40% cleaner with Super Clean brand detergent. There is a 70% chance of rain today. Take a look at each of these individually, maybe pause the video and look at the ways in which the reasoning fails. And I say ways only because we have 3 examples here, but what do they have in common? See if you can answer that question. Here is another example. It's presented by a statistician who has a website where the focus is statistics gone wrong. And we're told that an ad by Centrum claimed that, quote, 9 out of 10 Americans don't get all the nutrients they need from what they eat, and in fact are missing out on important vitamins and minerals, unquote. Notice that there's also arguably in this advertisement an appeal to fear, right? Oh no, I'm not getting the nutrients I need. 9 out of 10 Americans, that means I could be one of them. That's 90%. I'd better go get some Centrum, right? But what is the fear based on? Well, it's based on misleading stats. The statistician goes on in the evaluation of this piece of advertisement. The statement referred to a survey conducted between 1976 and 1980, which found that 9% of the participants remembered eating the recommended daily allowance of fruits and vegetables on the particular day covered by the survey. That suggested a whopping 91% of Americans were vitamin deficient. But there are some problems. It doesn't prove that any of those people were vitamin deficient. In fact, they could have loaded up with fruits and veggies the previous day. A one-day measurement is not, moreover, a good indication of overall diet. In fact, food intake should probably be measured over weeks in order to get the proper numbers on nutrition. Lastly, this statistician claims adequate nutrition can be obtained from less than the recommended number of servings. So all of this is meant to highlight what the statistician claims is a misleading statistic, namely 9 out of 10 Americans not getting the nutrients they need from what they eat. Let's move on to 2 related fallacies, false dilemma and false dichotomy. The latter, false dichotomy, occurs when someone presents 2 options as being exclusive and exhaustive, and you're meant to choose one of those as an inference. But The problem is that more than two options are available. False dilemma occurs when two options are presented, one of which is bad and the other one of which is really bad. And the idea is that you will choose the, quote, lesser of two evils without realizing that in fact other options are available, such that the dilemma is not real. From the stage play that was turned into a movie, A Few Good Men, we get, I have neither the time nor the inclination to explain myself to a man who rises and sleeps under the blanket of the very freedom I provide, then questions the manner in which I provide it. I'd rather you just said thank you and went on your way. Otherwise, I suggest you pick up a weapon and stand post. Now, here, Colonel Jessup is a witness in a murder trial, and he is presenting a false dichotomy, which is to say, look, maybe one of my guys killed somebody, but you know what? We're doing really great stuff. Either you stop criticizing what we do and the way we do it, or if you're going to criticize, then go ahead and pick up a gun and become a Marine. The other example is a love it or leave it claim. It could be the case that you both love America and you want to criticize it and you don't want to leave it. It could be the case that you love America and decide to leave it, and there could be other options. Typically, these false dichotomy fallacies involve presenting the or as exclusive. And if you study formal logic, and when you study in this class propositional logic, you'll recognize that in logic, the or is not always exclusive.
There are some people who say it's the best yogurt they've ever tasted. And there are some people who haven't tasted it yet. Delicious, non-fat, authentic Greek-strained yogurt.
So this commercial is interesting because technically we get what are called two existential claims. Some people who have tried Fage yogurt and loved it, and some people who haven't tried it. But the commercial's insinuation is that you are one of two groups of people, those who have tried Fage yogurt and loved it, and those who haven't tried it at all, the implication being that if you did try it, you would like it. But of course, what they don't talk about is the some people who tried it and didn't like it. And of course, it may be the case that the meaning of life just is cheese and crackers. Let's look at another example of a false dichotomy. I thought this was quite nice, so I just went ahead and copied it from the website link you see below at the bottom of the screen. And here we have someone talking about not committing himself or herself, the fallacy of false dichotomy. When I was in college, I was obliged to take a personality test during one of my classes. I objected that the multiple choices available on many of the questions were not clear or exhaustive enough for me to answer honestly. The teacher asserted that this was a purposeful feature of the test to force a choice in order to determine allegedly important distinctions. She then tried to illustrate her point of a forced choice by holding out a pencil within my close reach, equally between my right hand and left. Here, she said. I looked at her. She added, I am forcing you to choose either your left hand or your right. Now, in this piece, the writer goes on to say that he or she responded, no, I could choose not to reach out at all, or I could choose to reach out with both hands. So if you've ever found that multiple choice exams were problematic, then it may be because the choices offered were not exhaustive enough for you to feel like you're making a quote honest choice. Here's another example. We believe that poverty, caring for the poor and vulnerable, is a religious issue. Do the candidates' budget and tax policies reward the rich or show compassion for poor families? Do their foreign policies include fair trade and debt cancellation for the poorest countries? So notice we get a couple of rhetorical questions. You can reformulate those as statements. And we get basically that you either care for the poor and vulnerable in a certain way, or you have the policies that this individual is saying are not demonstrative of such care. We next move on to one of the most important set of fallacies, which I'm going to just sort of put under the umbrella false cause. So when we have false cause reasoning, we have reasoning whereby someone infers an effect from an alleged cause or infers backward from an effect to an alleged cause, but the causal relationship is faulty or erroneous. A really simple way to think about this would be to say, I get up in the morning and as the sun rises, I see planes taking off from my local airport. Therefore, the sun causes planes to take off. When you respond to that, well, no, there's a better way to account for planes taking off, then you've probably identified some version of a false cause fallacy. Here are some examples. UFOs must be propelled by some sort of electromagnetic source. On the night of the big power blackout in New York City, there were a number of reports of UFO activity in the area. So there are a couple of problems here. One is that the blackout was caused by UFOs, and the other is that UFOs are propelled by an electromagnetic source such that they would cause this blackout. Remember, UFOs are unidentified flying objects. Second example, if you want more available clean water per capita, you need fewer people on Earth. If you want to decrease vehicle emissions, you need fewer drivers. If you want the oceans to replenish their fish, you need fewer people. In other words, the implicit causal reasoning here is that people are causing all of the problems that we have, therefore we should eliminate a number of people. Last example, if strong law enforcement really prevented crime, then those areas where community policing were in effect would be the least likely to have high crime rates. Actually, the reverse is the case. For in those areas with high concentrations of police, serious crimes of all kinds are more common than in other areas where police visibility is much lower. Here, the arguer misunderstands the order of causation. Here is an example from our favorite source of fallacies, one of two favorite sources, I should say, advertising, the other being politics.
You give a little love, and it all comes back to you. You're gonna be remembered for the things that you say and do. You give a little love, and it all comes back to you. You're gonna be remembered for the things that you say and do.
So the implication here is that drinking Coca-Cola makes the world a better place. because drinking Coca-Cola has made a Grand Theft Auto criminal, or I guess a Grand Theft Auto-esque criminal, turn into a good guy who does good things, impacts people in a positive way, and they in turn do the same.
Very superstitious, writings on the wall. When you believe in things that you don't understand, and you suffer. Superstition ain't the way.
Now, if that Bud Light commercial is not a quintessential false cause fallacy example, I don't know what is. Of course, this cartoon, another one by a cartoonist I think is quite funny, Beck, is also a good example. There's one duck on the right looking sad. The duck on the left says, maybe you should ask yourself why you're inviting all this duck hunting into your life right now. It's a play on what a lot of us might say to our friends when we find someone is, continuously choosing the wrong boyfriend or girlfriend, and we say, you keep attracting the same sort of person. Of course, the problem here with the poor duck is the duck's not doing anything wrong. The duck's just being a duck. It happens to be duck hunting season. That's what's causing all of this duck hunting. And I always claim that a good liberal arts education, yes, must include classic texts, literature from Shakespeare and Newton's Principia and all sorts of great stuff, right? But it also has to include Gary Larson. Gary Larson's The Far Side is one of the most awesome, funny, smart cartoon series that I know of. All right, so we have the following. One toad or frog says to the other, wait a minute, Vince, last summer, remember? Some little kid caught you, handled you, and tossed you back in the swamp. That's where you got him. It's a play on the old saw that warts are caused by handling toads. All right, another version of a false cause fallacy is known as the slippery slope. The slippery slope is typically just an extended false cause fallacy. Basically what happens is this. Someone argues, typically it's to the negative, don't do this thing, whatever it is, or don't believe that thus and such is the case. And the reasoning is, if you do this thing, if you believe this thing, it's going to yield disaster, so don't even start. In other words, once you take a step off that slope, you will slide down into the muck. So what you want to look for when you're thinking about slippery slope is that break in the causal chain. If voluntary euthanasia were to be legalized, it would prove impossible to avoid the legislation, or at least toleration, of non-voluntary euthanasia. But even if the former can be justified, the latter clearly cannot. Hence, it is better that the first step not be taken so as to prevent a slide into non-volunteer euthanasia. So the idea is that doing this one thing is going to lead to such a bad consequence that nobody would accept, because we would all be in the position of potentially being killed, and so we should not allow any form of euthanasia. So what you want to do when you're looking at this sort of reasoning is to see if you can find out where there might be a gap such that the alleged cause really does not bring about the purported bad effect. You get some good examples of this. They're funny, but you get this in some commercials. I'll show you a couple in just a moment. But take a read here and try out what I just mentioned. Take a read and find where you think the reasoning fails? Where is the first misstep? Where is the first moment where the alleged cause would not be explained well in terms of the effect? In other words, the effect is not likely from the purported cause.
When you have cable and can't find something good to watch, you get depressed. When you get depressed, you attend seminars. When you attend seminars, you feel like a winner. When you feel like a winner, you go to Vegas. When you go to Vegas, you lose everything. And when you lose everything, you sell your hair to a wig shop. Don't sell your hair to a wig shop. Get rid of cable and up.
We've covered a lot of ground. We've covered a bunch of fallacies of relevance and a bunch of fallacies of unwarranted assumption. Throughout, we have looked at how fallacies work in ordinary language. Before we move on to discuss fallacies of ambiguity or diversion, take some time to work through the exercises in the text. And if you find what you think are fallacies in your daily experience, why not go ahead and share that with us by making a post, start a new thread on one of our forums, and identify the fallacy and analyze it, talk about what's gone wrong and why that reasoning is a problem. And then maybe other people can comment and work on other ways of articulating the same fallacy that you've identified, or maybe they might find another fallacy that's sort of entwined within the one that you've identified. All right, next up, fallacies of ambiguity or diversion.